So this week's thought for the weekend is, scar tissue makes relationships wear out. You're probably wondering, what does that mean? Well, let me explain. So first, if you haven't already experienced it, as your life goes on, you will realize it's really, really hard to build a relationship that lasts a long time. Really hard. Hard to have sort of a social relationship, pretty amazing. You know, when people can stay married for 25 or 30 years, get along with each other all that time, it's really pretty extraordinary thing. But professional relationships, really hard to maintain. It seems like all the best bands break up after a couple of years, and business partnerships fall apart all of the time. So why does that happen? Well, I don't think that it's because of a single catastrophic event that blows up the relationship. I think it's usually an accumulation of little issues. Because what happens in any relationship, inevitably, sooner or later, there will be conflicts in the relationship. And the question is, how do you resolve those? Well, oftentimes, a conflict won't quite get perfectly resolved. Somebody will be just a little bit unhappy with the result. And that's kind of like scar tissue. You know, scar tissue is when you get a wound and it doesn't quite heal perfectly. And the scar tissue is not as strong as the original tissue, more likely to tear or rend in the future. Same thing with relationships. These little bits of scar tissue just build up over time, and they become bigger and bigger and bigger. And then people start expecting bad behavior. And you know, when you expect bad behavior, you will find it. You absolutely will find it. And becoming more and more sensitive. And eventually this just builds up to the point where somebody decides they just don't care anymore. That's usually when something spectacular happens, and then the relationship explodes. But I would say it's not that the people were fundamentally bad. The relationship just wore out. By the way, one of my rules of life, you should never judge a person's character by how they behave during a breakup of a relationship, because people just do really crazy stuff then that's totally out of character. Anyhow, it wasn't necessarily a problem with the people. The relationship just wore out. So I'll give you an example of a relationship of mine that wore out. So a few years ago, we remodeled our kitchen. And the foreman for the contractor, Jim, was in our house pretty much every day for about 4 or 5 months. And if I'm honest, I have to tell you, overall, he did pretty good work. We were happy with the result. But there were just a few little things that Jim did that kind of bugged me. Like, they were supposed to have plastic up across the kitchen to keep dust from getting into the rest of our house. And for some reason, Jim just loved to open that plastic and leave it open. And I'd ask him to close it, and the next day we'd come back and there's dust all through the house. You could tell he'd left it open again. And Jim really didn't like to admit mistakes. When you point out things that were wrong, he'd try and kind of sidestep it or smooth it away. And so these things just started bugging me. Now, at the same time, I have to admit, I am probably a contractor's worst nightmare, because I am super, super detail-oriented and super picky. So every day, Jim would come in, and I'd have a nice big smile, "Hi, Jim," and just 1 or 2 little things you didn't quite get right yesterday, if you could fix those. I'm guessing that got pretty old for Jim as well. So over time, our relationship just got more and more and more tense. And our daughter, Kay, came home from college at Thanksgiving that fall, and I was whining about Jim. And then Kay said, "You know, Dad, I think your relationship with Jim may be wearing out." At which point my first thought was, maybe I shouldn't be exposing my daughters to my relationship theories. But she was right. She was right, it was wearing out. So the question is, what do you do? Well, I would argue if you want to have a long-lasting relationship, you have to somehow prevent the formation of scar tissue, or at least you probably can't completely prevent it, but try and slow it down as much as you can. And that means don't leave issues unresolved. You have to somehow try and end up, ideally, where there's zero lingering animosity after a conflict. Somehow you figured out a way that everybody is reasonably happy, comfortable with the outcome. That's hard. I think it takes communication. You have to be able to talk and listen so each person knows what the other person is thinking. And then compromise. Both people have to be willing to accept, you know, I get some of what I want, you get some of what we want, you want. Neither of us gets what we want completely, but to a point where you realize, okay, this was a reasonable outcome. I'm happy with that. And so to do this, you have to be willing to listen and see the other person's point of view. That's really hard. You know, there are some people that really compromise is just not possible for them. If they don't get 100% of what they want, they're not happy. Those people are going to have trouble forming long-lasting relationships. So here's a couple of mistakes. A classic mistake is you say, it's not a big deal. yeah, I'm not getting what I want, but I don't want to have a big argument over this. I'll just give in. Well, I would say, danger, you may be nuking the relationship. So yeah, you have to ask yourself, are you completely over it? Really, just 100% complete? Or is there some little nagging thing you're kind of hoping you'll get something back in return later on? But for example, would it be okay if whatever this behavior was, if the person did it every day over and over and over again? Because if you don't talk about it, they probably will do it every day over and over and over again. And if the answer is no, you're not actually okay, really totally okay with this, then you're creating scar tissue in yourself, and potentially you're nuking the relationship. So be careful about that. Now the other side is, well, suppose you're a type A, super aggressive, pushy person. You just argue and push and push and push and push until eventually the other person backs down. Well, you're thinking, this is great, no scar tissue here, what's the problem? But you're creating scar tissue in the other person. And so you're probably, even though you may feel satisfied, there's a chance you're nuking the relationship. So the thing you have to realize is a relationship only works if it's good for both parties. And whichever side you're on, you need to make sure it's good for you, you're okay with it, and it's good for the other person as well. So back to Jim, you may be wondering, did I have a heart-to-heart with Jim? Well, the answer, I didn't, because I knew it was a short-term job. By the time I was really annoyed with him, there was only a few more weeks to go. So we just put up with it. And we were on tense terms for the last few weeks of the work. But you can imagine what this would have been like. I said, Jim, it really hurts my feelings when you leave the plastic open. And sometimes I feel like you don't respect me as a person. The interesting thing is, if I had done that, I'm pretty sure it would have worked, because I'm pretty sure Jim would have done anything to make sure we never, ever had to have a conversation like that again. So when I've given this talk in the past, students sometimes come up and say, John, you're totally wrong, this idea about communicating and working it out. Psychologists have shown that isn't what makes long-term relationships work. That in fact, what makes long-term relationships work is you find areas where you have conflict and you just stay away from them. Just sort of keep away from those issues. And that may be, certainly if you can't work things out, that's the only alternative. To me, that's unsatisfying. It seems like as reasonable people, we ought to be able to work things out. But actually, that's one way of avoiding the formation of scar tissue. Stay away from areas where you're going to have conflicts. So here's a question for you. How many of you have seen scar tissue, either in a relationship of your own or somebody around you? Show of hands. How many people have seen scar tissue? Yep, happens to everybody, everywhere. So just in closing, I think the thing to realize is if you want a relationship to last, you need to keep the small things from building up into big things somehow, so that you don't have scar tissue wearing out your relationship. That's my thought for the weekend. Have a great weekend and see you Monday.